Joining us live now is John Kehoe, senior writer at the Australian Financial Review. John, thank you for your time.
Hey, Annalise.
Now, big story today is Scott Morrison coming back early from his holiday.
Yeah.
Now, this has been a really tricky one around Canberra because we all know the PM takes holidays. That's pretty understandable, but it's more the optics of how it was handled that's been quite poor.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's entitled to a break and a holiday. It's been a big year, as I'm sure it has been for his family, and I don't think anyone would begrudge him taking a break. But they probably should have been, as the Financial Review's been reporting and writing about, just more transparent and open about it from the start. The fact that they tacitly tried to sort of cover up that he'd gone away or where he was, just by sort of admission almost made it look, by admission they were admitting that it probably wasn't a good look for him to be overseas. I don't know, like, the guy's entitled to a break, but at the same time, the optics and the politics of it have now sort of left a void for Anthony Albanese to come in and start serving breakfast to the firefighters as well.
Absolutely, and it's just that kind of thing where normally if they go on leave, we get a press release saying someone says the acting Prime Minister in this time, and that was a bit of the confusion where we were like, well, who's actually in charge here? Yeah,
exactly. So they were a bit on the back foot on that, weren't they? Because we weren't sure if Michael McCormack was in charge or not, where Scott Morrison was. It's now officially emerged that he's been in Hawaii after most people already knew and assumed that that's where he was. But I think it's probably a lesson for this Prime Minister and his office, because sometimes there could be a bit more transparency from them. I know from my time working in the American system, it's very transparent. I mean, it's expected at all times the White House press gallery is told about where the president is. And this is hour to hour, event to event. If he's going out for dinner sometimes, and generally there'll be a press pack pool following the president wherever he goes, in case there's an incident, in case there's an event, in case something happens to him that needs to be reported to the American people.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Now, if we move on to your purview, and that's all things finance, it's been a big year for the government in particular. One of the really interesting things going into next year is going to be this interest rate discussion. It's kind of fallen by the wayside with my EFO and everything. But interest rates are at record low. There's not much room to move.
There isn't. So 0.75% at the moment. Most people, before the jobs numbers came out yesterday, were thinking they're going to cut again in February, the Reserve Bank. Now that's been discounted back because, 40,000 nearly new jobs in November, unemployment rate dropping to 5.2%. That's a good sign. So, I think it's to be determined whether the RBA actually ends up cutting rates in February. But I think regardless, they're probably quite likely to, at least in the first few months of next year. And then inevitably, you're going to get even greater tension, I think. I think this is a big story next year, and it has been to date also. The tension between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Should the government be doing more on the budget front to support the economy, or should the RBA, through ultra record low interest rates and potentially, quantitative easing, more extreme monetary measures maybe in the second half of next year, be called on? So, I think that's going to be the big sort of tension point next year, unless we get some sort of surprise pickup in economic growth and wages and inflation.
What do you think the outlook for the economy is like in the next year? Because we've seen a reduced surplus promised by the government at next year's budget, and that's in reaction, they're saying, to mainly global forces, but still a surplus is a surplus.
Yeah, I think we've got to distinguish between the budget and the economy. The budget is not necessarily the economy, and I think the budget is in all right shape, as long as the international situation doesn't deteriorate. And it looks like actually internationally things might actually be just gradually picking up a bit. The iron ore price, that's going to be a big determinant for the budget. If those Brazilian iron ore mines come back online, which appears likely at some point, we'll probably see a decline. So the government's been good there in conservative forecasting, but they'll still probably hit their surplus, I imagine, unless things go really bad. The big, I think, concern is the weakness in the domestic economy. That's the consumer. Just not a lot of consumer spending on discretionary items at the moment, and also business investment. So we really need, I think, more structural policies from the government to encourage that. Maybe a little bit more short-term stimulus if things really don't pick up in the first half of next year. The government's really going to hold the line on not doing that. But I think the key thing for the economy next year is we need to get the consumer spending, wages higher, and more business investment.
Now, when it comes to that consumer spending, it's really interesting because the argument has been that those tax cuts haven't had the impact they were supposed to because people are paying off their debt instead of going out and buying stuff. Do you think that that is the concern, or is it just retail in Australia is really soft? They've got a lot of global competitors that they just can't keep up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the story is like wages. They're just not growing as fast. Even if in real terms, as Matthias Cormann points out, they're doing okay because inflation's low. That's true. But people have borrowed huge amounts of debt over the last 5 or 10 years, basically baked on the sort of idea that our nominal wages are going to be increasing at the historic rate. And so now that they're not, they're sort of focusing on paying down that debt. So that we really need to get a little bit more wage growth, a bit more consumer confidence. I do think the RBA rate cuts and the tax cuts will start to gradually see more of a positive effect. They don't necessarily happen overnight. A few months down the track, you'll probably see people will realise that they've got more money in their bank accounts because they've started to save more, they're ahead on their home loan.
And maybe paying down that credit card.
It's not a bad thing that they're paying down the debt on the credit card on the home loan. And you'll probably see, I think, a bit of a gradual pickup, but probably not to the extent the economy needs. And you can't help but think we're going to continue to have not terrible economic growth, but just really subpar and not as much as the RBA needs to get wages and inflation going again.
What do you think of there's been this whole discussion about infrastructure spending needing to stimulate the economy, especially out in the regions? That seems to have really died off in the last 4 weeks. Do you think that is a political tactic from Labor, or is that something that should be actively considered?
Look, I reckon there needs to be more focus, not so much on the big bang infrastructure projects in Sydney and Melbourne, because we've already seen like there's a huge amount of cranes in the sky there. They're at capacity and a lot of those big projects. The cement is running short, that sort of stuff. But probably more on sort of infrastructure maintenance around the country and maybe some smaller projects as well. I mean, governments, and this is state governments as well, the IMF's pointed this out, the pipeline's going to drop off for them in about a year or two's time. And they can borrow incredibly cheaply. And the thing is for politicians, they like to cut the ribbon on a big brand new project and say, look at me, I've sort of built this project. But really, the big bang for the buck and the more sort of labour intensive part of infrastructure is the maintenance of infrastructure. It's not sexy. It maybe doesn't win as many votes, but it's actually probably a better return on the investment and good for the economy.
And moves quicker.
Yeah, and it's absolutely, it's you can roll it out quickly and it can hit the economy quickly as well. Spot on.
Well, I know I'm doing my part for consumption.
What are you doing for your Christmas shopping?
Just everything.
I feel I've just moved house and I have been spending an enormous amount on new furniture, fixing things in the house.
Who says Canberra doesn't contribute to the
exactly.
economy?
So that's why the RBA wants to get more housing turnover, more people buying and selling, because even if the house prices are only going up a bit, it's that turnover of the housing stock where people update everything in their house.
Well, I'll tell you what, they could fix interest rates and then I might have a bit more to spend on a house. John Kehoe, thank you as always for your time.
Thanks, Alice.